Welcome, everybody. Really been keen and been waiting for quite some time to get Nick Hudson back on. Many of you won't know, but he was with us before. That video didn't get much view because during that time we had two medical information strikes against our channel, and it had to be put through Odyssey. I'm going to later share that video and you can go watch, but I'm delighted to have him back, and this is going out on the Market Sniper. Nick Hudson is very active in private equity. He's a polymath in everything, I consider. Very eloquent, very smart, and has a great take on the world. We're delighted to have you back. Nick, welcome.
Thanks very much, Francis. I'm glad to be back and going out on a bigger channel.
Indeed. Yes, we've actually finally grown despite the algorithm's efforts. I think we've made it to 100,000.
Wow.
But anyway, belligerent persistence over any real gift, I have to say. But anyway, we warrior on, as we always do. I'm going to start on the financial space because you're very capable in that space too, as a multi-talented man. And we'll get into some of the other topics that you're possibly more famous for. But people don't recognize that obviously you're very astute in the financial space as well. Markets rates are heading up on the US debt side. That's the 10 years. We're seeing a debt-based and fiat-based collapse. And we're also simultaneous to see the rotation into the millennial preservation assets of gold and, of course, silver benefiting as a monetary metal. It will be interesting also to have you on record because I've got a feel for many of your takes on many things. But where do you see the world as it is right now in terms of the macro? And I'm talking not just at a South African level here, but globally.
Well, I mean, that situation can be summed up in two words, and you have to say very little more than those two words: unsound money.
100%.
Yeah. Quite a lot of things come along with that. There's been a drift away from sound principles of commercial management. So in my industry of private equity, many characters, especially in the United States and in Western Europe, have taken up this whole mantra of stakeholder capitalism, which is basically socialism in drag. And it's been a disaster for private equity returns. It'll get much worse. So for me, the thing that I'd wish to have is sound money. And the thing that I can have, because it's up to me to do it, is good old-fashioned shareholder capitalism. And that kind of motivates my daytime existence to good effect, I might add. We've been achieving really good returns by ignoring all of the noise of ESG and stakeholder governance and DEI and proceeding in a way that is fundamentally antithetical to all of those.
Yes, I love that. We have to become almost islands of sound money in our own spheres of activity we have to offer a solution. We can't just be doomers about this global creeping digital communism, as I would call it. As you say, stakeholder is man in drag for socialism, and socialism is man in drag for actually too much government intervention that actually leads us to a sort of Bolshevik communism, as I sometimes refer to it. Not always treated with delight when I use that phrase.
Yeah.
But so too much debt. You would concur with the too much debt argument, a parabola of devaluation potentially in a convexity downwards that's leading to these moves in precious metals. How do you see, in terms of people that just want to look at the world financially, and that's very narrow, we have to admit, and we'll broaden out when we get later on. But how should they be everyday housewife and husband accountants working in a small practice, maybe a small lawyer, professional middle-class people of the world? How do you see they should be positioning for the oncoming train, as I would like to probably refer? What would you suggest in terms of, and how are you potentially doing that too?
Yeah, look, so there are a couple of things to emphasize here. The unsoundness of money, or let me put it the other way around. Sound money is one of the things you'd like to have if you're trying to generate returns in the real world. And then sound economic policy, and I'm talking about at a micro level when you're running companies and allocating capital and that kind of thing. is something that you'd like to have. And sound money is not enough to guarantee the latter, and performing the latter is not enough to overcome unsound money in all states, but you can have a good go at it, you know. What unsound money does is basically to expropriate, to steal from those who are far away from the levers of power, and to, you know, transfer wealth to the establishment, or the elite, or the elite, or whatever you'd like to call them. So how can you minimize the theft by our great leaders? Well, a good first principle is to minimize the number of layers of intermediation. You want to be as close to real assets as possible. If you can avoid having a whole, you know, multi-layered cake of advisors and intermediaries and custodial arrangements and so on between your money and the ultimate underlying real asset, then you're doing the best you can.
Can I insert their digital proxies as well?
Yes, that's very clear. That's becoming abundantly clear recently. You know, the world of cryptocurrencies, and the world of digital representations of money in the form of bank accounts has become much more treacherous. The same is true for share certification. So your entitlement to the ownership of the residual interest in companies. All of these things have become much more tenuous than they used to be 30 years ago. And so this is the first point of attention, is to diminish layers of intermediation, to get as close to real assets as possible. And for many people, that's a frightening thing, because it's often easier to do that in their own backyard. And they say, well, that's an aggregation of risk, because I can't rush off to another country if things go pear-shaped in mine, and all my assets will be in that backyard that I've just decided to leave. And that is another challenge to think through. You know, how do you get real assets that aren't on your doorstep? So that's the first principle, is eliminating layers of disintermediation. And then the other one is to stay as close to the real economy as possible, to be very wary of anything that delves deeply into the abstract. So, for example, I would regard the current fashion for AI as a complete bubble. I would regard financialization as a multi-decadal bubble. You want to be in businesses that are investing in real goods and services, and as close to the actual underlying factories and you know, offices of those businesses as possible.
I love that. Getting close to source, basically. And there's very little I need to add. I think very like-minded in that. In fact, I want to talk to you about ETFs, because one of the videos you did, that you made some really salient features. And if I were to do the sort of 5-bullet summary of, you know, guest Nick Hudson on this particular video that I'm watching, one of the things was the grotesque misallocation of capital. And I see the derivative proxy, which is the ETF, that separates the gold owner or the silver owner from the actual physical holding. And in the same way, we've had the crowding out of fund into the 5 trillion Nvidia and Mag 7 market cap. And I feel, and we're going to get some degree conspiratorial at here, without doubt, without two minds, but I feel that this has afforded them a very powerful currency in their equity valuations. And ETFs, because they were initially low cost and outperforming active managers, everybody ended up crowded out into the ETF. The ETF keeps buying that which is scaled, because they need liquidity, because they've got a fat pipe of everybody's money coming in, all of retail. And then you end up getting this asymmetry of balance in a market. Normally markets should return to mean, but actually if you're a tiny bit to the left, you go to the extreme, and if you're on the right, you go to the extreme. And we're getting political polarization, but in capital we've kind of had that and I'm looking at very much with my precious metals versus tech hat on and saying sound money, intrinsically held, silver miners are now almost too small by market cap to attract reasonable money. So it's a doom loop of failure. Now, eventually that changes if they keep outperforming. But you got the further reaffirming loop of what goes up gets chased harder. And the ETFs are part of that. And they sort of computer buying their way ever in. And then they take the proxy voting. So they seized power and they escalated an incredibly powerful equity-based currency for the surveillance grid builders. And actually, it's not in their interest to see a massive rotation out of Mag 7 coming back down into miners and physical resources. So we have this incredible dichotomy of Bloomberg and all the financial channels not talking about silver or gold, particularly silver and platinum very much, or miners, but talking about Trump going on a major resource empire building, which is all about resources such as miners, Greenland, Venezuela, and everything else he wants to go. So they sort of cover it from a political sense, but they don't want to get into the repercussions as to why on that sense. Am I deluding myself? Was there something going on here? And what's your take on the crowding out of funds? And tell us a little bit more about what you mean by grotesque misallocation of capital.
There was a hell of a lot worth picking up on in what you just said. Starting off with the ETF theme, the point I would add to yours is that ETFs are not a vanilla phenomenon in the sense that the devil is in the detail of the custodial structure. So, for example, if you're investing in a gold ETF, there's a range of qualities in those ETFs, and it's very, very difficult to assess. So, for example, you might have a fund that will tell you the registration numbers of the gold bars in a Swiss vault that you own as a result of your investment in the ETF. So all they're doing is sitting there as a one-step intermediary between you and a gold bar in a vault in Switzerland. And that's an entirely different proposition from a fund that tries to track the gold price by investing in derivatives. And if the derivatives are listed on the Chicago board, then that's a different story from if the derivatives are listed somewhere else. I mean, you don't know, and then until you've looked into it, what kind of counterparties you're dealing with, how many layers of intermediation, how many counterparties, how many times the underlying asset has been rehypothecated. All of these things vary from fund to fund. So I wouldn't like to tar all ETFs with the same brush. There clearly is a huge range of quality. But the irony in all of this is that the whole principle of exchange-traded funds was very closely linked to indexation and tracking of market prices. And the idea was that the man in the street is incapable of selecting a good asset manager from a bad one. And so therefore, it's best to just default to the market proxy. But the man in the street is equally bad at picking the sound custodial structure from the unsound one. These are all horribly technical processes. And so, for that reason, I'm very careful. Where my personal money is invested back into my own business. I'm very much a fan of the old Warren Buffett epithet, put all your eggs in one basket and watch that fucking basket. He might not have used the expletive that I use, but I mean, it's appropriate. So I do have a weighting towards that which I can manage and control and know that there's nobody in between me and the actual factory or company. And outside of that, I've walked back from ETFs under concern for the custodial arrangements. And where I have money invested with other managers, it's with people who I've known for decades and who I trust for reasons that are more related to how many bottles of wine I've had with them than to anything that they write in their marketing documents. They're kind of like I know where they live, and if they try to steal my money, I'll come and steal their poodles. So I've become to think of the world as we have this phenomenon of increasing fakery and increasing insubstantiality in everything that's on the market and everything that's in the news, I become more and more conservative and more local in my investing strategies.
I think that's super smart because of, as you say, the how many degrees of um, uh, distance are there between you and the end asset, and it ties into very well with your first point. And you actually said a couple of things that's quite salient, and so far I've been a bit underwhelmed by the AI phenomenon, but you actually mentioned for all this investment and all the data centers so far. Now, maybe many people, technologists, will argue with you, but one of your main points is AI isn't truly intelligent. It's just it's an advanced pattern matching automation that excels at narrow, low complexity tasks. And I'd like you to delve a little bit more on that, because people go, "Ooh, the computer, wow, and AI, that's just, next level. I've been out geniused here." Rein it back for the humans against the machine here for us.
So all technology can really be reduced to automation, broadly described. So people say to me, "Oh, but back in the old days, the really ancient times, man invented the bow and arrow." And so I said, yes, they automated killing. It's killing at a distance, without having to risk limb and life. And so all so printing is the automation of writing. And the reason I say this is I'm asking for a little bit of latitude here. It is very useful to conceive as technology as that which automates human tasks. And I've always regarded artificial intelligence as a complete misnomer. It is a very natural emanation from the intelligence and creativity of human beings. And that intelligence and creativity is mainly oriented around producing more with less. And that involves automation in every step along the way. And so I say, no, we shouldn't call it artificial intelligence. We should call it natural automation, because it's human driven. It's the humans who are devising the algorithms and finding out how to bring more and more data into the decision-making ambit, finding out better ways of filtering that information to separate the wheat from the chaff. And that story is as old as time. The invention of fire and the wheel were no different. Automating human beast of burden activities, that's what the wheel did. And I think we are, to say that there's around the corner some spectacular way in which AI is suddenly going to emerge on the scene with general intelligence or sentience or something, is one of the most absurd and fantastical ideas to hold in one's mind, because I don't believe that we are even out of the starting blocks in being able to describe how the human mind has a capacity for solving problems and for creativity, broadly described. There's we have no idea how to write that down in algorithmic form, how to get it to happen in silico, and for a bunch of reasons that we shouldn't really try to discuss now because it would take the whole show. I don't think that those capacities are ever going to be manifested in silico.
I 100% agree with you. And we often mistake something that's been able to be done more efficiently or quickly as an entire new technology. Meanwhile, it's just a quicker way of doing something we used to do before. I mean, traveling from A to B, a car is not a technology, it's a faster way of transporting yourself. The arrow was a faster way of throwing a killing implement. A gun is a faster way still. It's essentially a stone thrower down a tube. And I 100% get what you do. And I also find myself resenting. And I have to say, the one fear I don't have is lying awake at night expecting my particular processes and the things I do to be replicated and to be out of work, business, or anything.
No.
But I think many do. So the two of us are both pushing back. People should not get deer in the headlights about, oh my goodness, AI replaced me.
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And it's not even worth really discussing. And you know, the way this is not to say that there are no benefits from these tools. I mean, I use them often enough to save myself time in research. I'm not being paid by anybody to do that. I don't think the value of it is particularly high, but there is an incremental benefit. But this has been true for most of the innovations in the computer era. The benefits have been there, but they've been more or less offset by creeping centralization in both in the political sphere and in the commercial sphere. So the expectations for the benefits of the mainframe computer, the benefits of the personal computer, the benefits of digitization, the benefits of the word processor, the benefits of AI, they've all been, cast in these dramatic terms when the technologies arise. But in the ensuing years, we don't see anything really. And I think the reason we don't see anything, whereas we should be expecting a little bit, is that our policies have centralized, and centralization is fundamentally destructive of creativity and of growth.
Yes, and it's a communist model. It has
It's
too
a
much say
socialist model.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I've been insistent on separating socialism from communism recently because I kind of worry that when people bandy about terms like fascism and communism and technocracy, they remove the spotlight from the historical trajectory that we are all grappling with. And I believe that we will think through this better if we label things by their serious old school definitions. So, you know, communism is an imaginary, fantastical end state with no description in the theory as to how you would attain it, where there is no state and there are no markets, and everybody owns things collectively, and you move on like that. But communism has never been attempted anywhere. It's kind of just a marketing idea. What has been attempted numerous times with 100% failure rate for reasons which we have understood and fully described for at least half a century is socialism. And it's the thing that's being attempted again. And the fact that it has elements that overlap with fascism or with this surveillance state technocracy is largely incidental. The core problem that we face is that advocacy of socialism, which has been in place and ascendant for roughly 150 years, is now enjoying a resource allocation that is without precedent in human history.
I like that you particularly specific on phrase emphasis, although for some reason I had a different take. So the fascism always involves the corporate element as part and parcel with government for me. That's an easy one. Communism was central ownership and no private ownership, which is when you hear the World Economic Forum referring to you will own nothing, and it's essentially a rentier model and be provided with a UBI. That points to me to an end goal that sounds more communistic.
So, the difference
so tell
there
me
is
where
that,
you differ, because that's interesting.
So the difference there is that they definitely entertain a state. So communism is meant to be freeing man of the state and the market. The tyranny of the state and the tyranny of the market is meant to disappear in the communist world, and it's never been attempted anywhere. I think some analysts
So what would you
locate
refer
an
to the
attempt in Russia.
USSR, though? The
Well,
USSR under Stalin, was that not a
yes,
communism then?
no. Under Lenin, there was like a 2-week attempt.
Yeah.
Some analysts say. I'm not really convinced by what they say. And so you need to distinguish between socialism and communism. So under socialism, the state or collective format expressed in government owns the bulk of assets. So the you have a situation where there's centralized ownership, and the marketing spin that's put on that is that it will be the workers who govern the allocation of resources and the distribution of income in this world where the state owns everything. But markets still exist and the government still exists, and that's socialism. And I think what you will own nothing and be happy echoes is socialism risen at the level of the global economy.
Yeah. Okay. Let's leave that one there because I think we'll have a great chat on that. I want to always correct phraseology if I'm incorrectly using it because I value accuracy. But let's wrestle with something else. One of the other points you made, and by the way, this is what I use AI for, and I'm looking at it now, that it does really quickly, is you can put a YouTube in of recent appearance, such as I have done for yourself, and just say, the 10 bullet summary. And so it allows me to have footnotes a lot quicker. I think that's my main thing for AI, speed. And then,
Yes.
people doing funny videos of, non-existent things and really annoying shorts that make me question anymore what's real and not. So I'm going into seeing is no longer believing. But, we probably got there maybe for some people with the lunar landings, but now we're definitely there, no matter what your take is on that. So there's actually been a starve out of the rest of the economy. And it's been a redirect. There's your key point, which I absolutely agree with on here, is that capital is not being redirected to actual infrastructure. And if I go to America, I would imagine you travel a fair amount. I mean, the airports, Kennedy and Guardia, they're horrible airports. They're straight out the 70s compared to Singapore or Qatar, etc. But they've got huge data centers, and they're even like the cuckoo in the nest. The people living next to them are finding their electricity bills going on. So they're socializing a massive cost that these guys have leveraged up extensively to build in the name of build it so big, be the biggest place. At some point, we will have utilization and data that will be needed in all of these storage, and everyone will be on a subscription model and we'll earn it all back. Tell us a little bit more about how you feel about the data center and the crowding out, because we also had the czar. I'll just throw in as a final point. Forgive me for the long form question, but I'll give you a free rein. The chap called Sachs, who's the official czar for data centers and AI in America, saying, well, it's reached a point now that if we don't support the data, the economy would turn into recession if you didn't keep supporting it. So there's a lot of too big to fail type vibes as well creeping into this. So tell me your take on just generally that scenario as well.
I'm going to accept your invitation to dilate here, because I think that achieving a real understanding for what's going on when it comes to data centers and their energetic commitment requires quite a deep dive into history that's quite old. When it comes to people who think intelligently about the world, trying to understand the geopolitical situation, there's first of all the bulk of humanity who believe that what they read in the New York Times or the Financial Times or the Economist is instructive in some way. We can call them the normies, and they're completely misguided, because that's a completely false appraisal of reality and has been for probably centuries. I know those titles didn't exist centuries ago, but mainstream media has always been a captured phenomenon, and you can learn very little from it, other than what it is that somebody else is trying to get you to believe that is false. So outside of that majority of certainly people in Western societies, the serious analysts probably have in common an assessment that goes something along the following lines, and that is that through most of the modern era, the world has been, broadly speaking, under the control of an Anglo-American establishment, and that the causes of major events in history as they are presented to us are actually not well explained by those presentations. So I'm talking here about phenomena like the Anglo-Boer War, the First World War, the Second World War, the financial crisis of 2006, 7, 8, or major historical phenomena are misrepresented in these media, and that there's an establishment that has been more or less selecting who it is that we have on offer for the purposes of making our supposedly democratic electoral choices. And we have been under the supervention of unsound money, once again conducted by this establishment. And this is history that's thoroughly documented by books that are suppressed heavily. I'm talking now about authors like Carol Quigley and Yuan Rati, sorry, it's a
And
Romanian name. Ratiu, that's it, Ratiu. And very well referenced works, copiously documenting how the establishment has manipulated vast swathes of the world over a period extending beyond a century, certainly well beyond a century. I think most serious analysts accept that. The disjoint at the present moment is between those who believe that, like me, that establishment is still very firmly in control of the show, those who, like the MAGA crowd, believe that Trump is our savior and that he's taking on the city of London, and that the Anglo-American establishment
oh
is
dear.
fractured, and that is now the Republican Party in the US who's waging war against the City of London and the Bank of International Settlements. And
Oh dear.
I call them the Hopium Copium Brigade. And
Yeah.
I must tell you, there's some very serious, interesting people who tell
Awesome.
plausible stories, who I like to listen to and I like to engage with, who are in that camp. So I don't completely dismiss them, but it's just not the camp that I'm in. And then there's a third camp, which we can call, if you want to use a benevolent phrase that's acceptable in most quarters, we can call it the Pax Judaica, the camp. I've been very amused recently to see a figure who I haven't seen for more than a decade. His name is Zhe Jiang. Zhe Jiang. Chinese names are always a fistful, and I
Yeah.
think Jiang is the surname, so I should really be saying it in reverse order. But he's recently emerged on the scene talking about Pax Judaica, and he believes clearly that it's not an Anglo-American establishment in control, but the state of Israel. And of course, there are darker versions of that involve, horribly anti-Semitic perspectives and so on. And then intermediary things where people see it as a manifestation of Zionism and so on. But you've got these three camps amongst kind of serious commentators. The one that says the Anglo-American establishment is still in control, the one that says it's been fractured and Trump is fracturing it, and another one that says basically the Israeli cognoscenti and intellectual establishment has captured the Anglo-American establishment, and what we can look forward to is instead of a Pax Britannica or a Pax Americana, is a Pax Judaica. Those are the three schools of thought. So there aren't really any others that I've come across apart from the fruitcake ones, which go on about various esoteric schools of thought, the Masons, the black nobility, etc., etc. And so that's where we are in the world, is with there really is nobody serious talking about history and geopolitics who does not at least engage with the seminal idea of the Anglo-American establishment. Now, what does that have to do with data centers? The key manipulation of the Anglo-American establishment was to assert the ascendancy of, at first, liberal democracy or liberalism, leading to an end game of Fabian socialism, which is to say gradualist socialism. And they have been working relentlessly for 100 and something years to bring this about. And it is quite clear that in many ways they have been successful in quite a spectacular way. And a key component of Fabian gradualism is that the end point of a highly centralized polity, governance on a global scale through organs like the Bank of International Settlement and the United Nations and so forth, and the continual erosion of the nation state will be salubrious for the world. And what they fall for when they engage with that fantasy is a belief that complexity can be mastered by commanding more data and better algorithms. And this is a false apprehension. It's always been false. We didn't understand 100 years ago why it was false, but we understand now that complexity cannot be dealt with by more data and better algorithms. The only way one proceeds towards human flourishing under conditions of complexity is by way of distributed, decentralized trial and error, conjecture and criticism, because we are completely incapable of predicting the effects of our interventions and actions under conditions of complexity. And this understanding was brought to us by actually a large number of people who more or less had the idea in different ways, but the famous ones are people like von Hayek and von Mises. So we know that that's the case. And people who are enamored of this kind of global socialist trajectory, the technocratic surveillance state, the Tony Blairs and Bill Clintons and Barack Obamas of the world, to talk about our current era, the old Fabians, George Bernard Shaw and his ilk, at the turn of the previous century in South Africa, Cecil John Rhodes and Lord Alfred Milner. The fallacy that they have all fallen for is this seductive vision of the world managed by scientists, by technocrats. And whereas every attempt to implement such a system on a national level, for example, in the USSR, has failed prodigiously, the get out of jail free card that today's generations of centralists will play is that this time is different because we have more data and faster computers to analyze it. And AI is very much quicker models, better models. That's what I mean by faster, better algorithms, And today's AI phenomenon is simply a manifestation of that same chimerical mirage. That we are no closer to being able to make better decisions under the conditions of complexity because of the advent of AI and computers and data centers than we were in caveman times. And so this project of AI is going to fail. And even it's
like ESG, just to intervene, because that's kind of a closet failure that's slowly being admitted, but they're pushing through anyway because they want us in battery cars. It's like it's a tag. They can take remote control. They can't do that on an ICE engine. Is there some comparisons and parallels?
Yes. Yes. All of these notions of global standards and protocols and central governance and standards that all companies should adhere to, such as ESG and DEI and stakeholder capitalism. I would say even, something like that people don't get too fazed by, but international accounting standards. I think all of these things. I'm even fond of saying that, the corporate world is being destroyed, is dying a death of 1,000 best practices.
Yeah, uniformity is the way.
Yeah.
How do you ever have a model that does something different and actually has a breakthrough or an additional feature for having it? It's a bit like Porsche. They put the engine in the back. But when you have four-wheel drive, you get more traction. You get a lot more grunt for your power. If everyone just went mid-engine, you've got to have those other models that maybe don't make sense, that look inferior, but actually later are shown to be perfectly positioned for something else. And what you're saying is this, but isn't that a form of communism? So if I talk to my Russian woman, they all had the same salt pepper. They all had the same furniture piece. Nobody got anything better, scientist, teacher.
They didn't implement communism. It hasn't been implemented anywhere. And again, I'm going to the strict Marxist definition of communism. What was implemented in Russia and what was implemented in North Korea and in Cuba and in China
Okay, let's call it was the USSR. So let's go the
Union of Soviet Socialist Republics.
It was social. So let's not get. I want it offline and have a chat more, and because I might have to flex, but I want to share point. But in that trajectory, let's just say, of centralization of government and uniformity, and it's about this equality. There's a difference between equality of rights and equality of outcomes, and that was something before he went soft in the head, our friend Jordan Peterson who did accurately when he was being made to say somebody else's pronouns and he had support for that in the beginning, and then I'm afraid he lost us when it seemed he got captured. But he's right on that point, isn't he?
It's interesting. One of the things that I've only in recent years come to appreciate is that socialist theory doesn't actually articulate how two things are meant to be manifest. The one is control of productive assets of the commanding heights by the working classes. There's no tract in socialism that actually describes any coherent mechanism for bringing about such control. That's a false.
There's incredibly high tax rates, which actually see you be a net disposer over time, that sees government be a net owner. That is a reallocation because you're removing the private ownership. I mean, you know,
but that doesn't guarantee that the working class are going to supervene over that. It could be an even worse concentration of wealth, and that is in fact what you see. Is that
the government
if you go back to the late 1900s, when socialist universities were being funded and established, like the London School of Economics and so on, it was the wealthiest capitalists in the world who were backing the formation of those universities. And what is very clear to me is that they were doing so because they understood that they would be able to disguise a labor-friendly, working-class friendly story. They would be able to disguise an elitist theory as a working class and labor-friendly theory. And that is exactly what they did. They never provided the mechanism by which state control of assets would result in distribution of the fruits of labor and of capital to the working classes or to the demos.
Yeah, the champagne socialists. It's sort of socialism for thee, but not for me. You know, there's a strata
it's worse.
which gets protected.
The champagne socialists are the people who are immune from the ravages of the immediate implementation of centralization. Here we are talking about people who knew that the actual concentration of wealth would be far higher under the system that they were proposing, and that they would be the beneficiaries of it. So that's the first thing, is the working class illusion that somehow socialism would benefit the working class.
No.
Yeah,
I agree with that. It's they go into scavenge mode. We've coined the term because they've lost the debt markets. They can't borrow anymore, and they've been overspending. And most of that's on welfare. If you think of the European model, you didn't mention on your three patterns which one you subscribe to most. Because
I thought I made it clear.
Sorry.
I subscribe to the theory that the Anglo-American establishment is intact and still in power, and that though the phenomenon of Jewish exceptionalism, which we observe in so many fields of human endeavor, and I've encountered enough phenomenal Jews in my time, genuinely phenomenal Jews in my time, to see that as a kind of natural manifestation, though there may be several significant Jewish characters throughout history who feature among the leading lights of the Anglo-American establishment, or at least its main foot soldiers. I do not see the world as having any risk of being governed by something that is fundamentally associated with Judaism or the State of Israel. In fact, I think closer to the truth is the American author Richard Poe, who wrote a book called How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. So I regard Pax Judaica as a sort of a distractive technique probably invented by the Anglo-American establishment, who, by the way, were responsible for the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the State of Israel in the first place. I think they're also
well, that was Lord Rothschild getting the letter, though, wasn't it? From
yeah, and before that, our very own, there's a lineage which would require probably 2 podcasts to discuss, which is how Cecil John Rhodes and the Lord Milner were so central in galvanizing the financial, the banker elite of the Anglophone world around this project of centralization and ultimately of the Fabian society's socialist trajectory and Fabian gradualism. That's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
Gradualism as opposed to Bolshevik revolution.
For many who are watching this who don't know of the Fabians, I think particularly of the American side, they know of Masonry and lots of other things, but the Fabian is the famous wolf in sheep's clothing, and it's a society that has very Anglo-based links. The United Kingdom,
It's Anglo-American.
Yes, it's Anglo-American, but it started. Britain was before America in that sense, so its roots, I think, would be British, but it's very Anglo-American. The Tavistock Institute would be another typical example of these kind of that different, but it's probably working together, type.
So just to, I see how that perception might be created because a lot of the bricks and mortar were located in London. The London School of Economics I mentioned earlier is a good example. But the extent to which American funding was deployed to that end with the knowledge of the bankers doing the funding is quite extensive, and it starts very early on, surprisingly early. We must remember that there was no sense that America was like really a world power in the late 1900s. American ascendance was very much something that the product of the 2 world wars,
And countries were prepared to die to control it, in a sense of knowing, though, if you think about France and Britain and the establishment of Canada. So they certainly saw it as the Liberty Woman of the statue that ended up being sent from the Masons of France. They certainly saw that.
Prevailing thought in the 19th century was that Argentina had much better odds of being a future empire than America.
Yeah, it's interesting one with recent events in Patagonia, which incidentally also have Boers that left when the British started marching north over there. So it's one of the few other places where you can get Afrikaans. So we touched on Quigley, which actually he looked after Clinton. Funny enough, he was the Robert Rubin of Clinton in his formative era, the author. So it was funny, he was writing the book that was disclosing it, but actually he was actively involved with, I think, the grooming of Clinton. So there's so many parallels that are really interesting that you've touched on in this broader sweep. I'm not sure I entirely concur. I see there's a 2-tier justice system along, with Israel and the free get out of jail card. But that's interesting discussion, and we'll have a beer over that. But let's bring it back to financial markets and some useful advice that could actually serve people in terms of positioning, because we certainly both sense that there are forces that are in existence that are moving us in a direction, and both you and I don't see it as a particularly good one for the everyday man in the street. And the question then becomes, let's forget the minutiae. We've all got study to do in our history on who it may be. You do need to understand some element of that to actually combat it. But Also, how do the self-reliance going coal-face, reducing the degrees of separation. Those were already good comments that I really liked that you made in terms of fighting back against these parasitic forces that actually. But one of the things that might be construed to be optimism regarding your AI discovery is they might push the windmills, they might go down and all the things that didn't work, that killed eagles, burnt, were difficult to dispose of, and eventually go down a dead-end road, which actually led to excessive debt and financial collapse for many institutions, by the way. Are they going to do the same thing with AI? Because the concern on AI is you add robotics, mundane tasks, and then less mundane tasks, AI and learning. And the three aspects of capitalism was based off capital, entrepreneur, and labor. And everybody's been wondering, Elon's been promising as a complete controlled opposition, everyone's going to be wealthier and better health and sit at home and have all this time in the world. And my position is the Deagle stats loom large and other possibilities that may or may not imply some sort of thing. But you look at the recent events with CB19, it doesn't look like there are, apart from, say, Russia, that there's a nurture and growth of population agenda. In actual fact, it looks like we could be getting set up. There's rarely been a particular ethnicity actively antagonized that later doesn't have some form of genocidal, they had it coming, they did that. And there's been quite some stigmatization over the white European male and various other things that were pushed more under Biden, but I think they might rear their head again. So I suppose the question is, are we at existential threat? Let's just say white Europeans globally, generally. Is there some form of agenda? And labor more broadly, which can be all humanity, as a result of the aggressive push, crowding out of funds, and the acceleration towards AI, digitization, and automation, robotics, and those kind of topics? Or are they going to fail? And, we still need folks for things. And we're going to do this green revolution and then pull back.
The reason I'm hesitating is there's a yes and no story here. Yes, there was an identification early on in the Fabian trajectory that the people who would fight hardest against it were the citizens of the very countries in which Fabianism originated.
Yes.
And their plans and thoughts around how best to deal with that problem were written down a long time ago and are being implemented now. You can find, for example, tracts where displacement theory, mass immigration is proposed, but where they even go down into the detail of saying, look, before we push a lot of immigrant Muslims into the UK population, we should be careful just to make sure that we put some moderate ones in first so everybody gets used to them. And eventually that becomes, well, we should use the Sikhs. And 1970s, if you go into the Monty Python movies and that kind of thing, the comic stuff is around, a Sikh in London, because they were the sort of more palatable, perceived as more palatable to
benign.
indigenous UK people. So this is a very old plan. But
so clergy, is it a thing or not for you? Because that's got
something like that. Like, I mean, I've never gone deep into clergy because it's sort of like, whether there was somebody who articulated this a plan much older than him, in a slightly different way is not of too much interest to me. But clergy is a thing, and I suspect that it's probably an interesting thing to delve into. But I already know that there was this idea that we needed to get rid of these pesky people who thought in terms of individual liberty and creativity and decentralized management in terms of self-responsibility and agency in the world.
Can I add a further element into that? A high preponderance and proliferation of natural eugenicists, thinkers, and eugenicist societies, such as Bill Gates's father and many others. So
Stanley Johnson, Boris Johnson's
many others,
father,
yeah, Stanley,
Elon
many
Musk's
others.
father,
And you
grandfather.
also have the offhand remarks of the late Prince of whatever, the Queen's husband, what was his name?
Prince Philip.
Prince Philip, thank you,
Yeah.
and various others. So that it seems to be quite well established aspect of now AI failing, which I love the idea of, although it's going to waste a lot of money, cause a lot of bankruptcies, devalue a lot of fiat. I'm a gold and silver investor. I might be okay with that. The problem is the rest of the world's going to, cost of living is going through the roof. We're going to have a hyper stagflation is our opinion on the economic model. I'd like your take also on that. There's so much to talk about. But they do have this as an intent, is my underwriting opinion. There's too many markers that I've seen, and an actual and more muted response to Eastern, more compliant societies. I've seen it actually said Japan and certain parts of China that would, comply, and the troublesome questioning renegades of, the white European nations would be the biggest problem, and get over the biggest problem. Because I saw Bitcoin, as an example, they wanted to win the libertarians first as part of what I think is a psyop of digitization and money. Of course, you create pumpermentals and get rich. Everybody's going to run the money. But you first wanted the libertarians on board, the Fed guys. You wanted all of them. You win your biggest guys over. Then everyone goes say, oh, if he's okay with it, I just follow. The sad fact is we're a herd and most people follow. There's few leaders. And so they wanted to capture that. So they created this narrative, Satoshi and whatever. We think that's a parable of a guy. So I'm kind of curious where that leaves us with your notion that they will fail, because I'm concerned that they will succeed to enough of a degree that they're going to undertake great levels of depopulation.
Yeah, look, the harms will follow from centralization. All of these things that you're referencing, the depopulation agenda, and so on, are manifestations of the simple problem of a failure to have sufficient regard for complexity, with one problem in what I'm saying. So I think that's the case for all the sincere believers in socialism, in depopulation theory, in Malthusian theory. All the sincere believers in those ideas are people who've simply not had the intellectual wherewithal to contend with the consequences of complexity. But I do worry.
I think it's a spiritual end goal that they are belligerent and belief-based around. And regardless of the feedback, they're going to storm on for it. That's where I think I differ.
Well,
in other words, it's a messianic outcome that they have to achieve.
What I was going to say is I do worry that somewhere behind the curtain, there are people who fully understand that these are fairy tales they've fed people, and that the consequences are going to be devastating, but who back themselves to hold on to enough of a diminishing pie that and who have a vision of the world that simply involves sharing it with fewer other human beings. And so in that way, the way you talk about a messianic vision, I do entertain that behind the curtain there are such people. You don't find them in the rank of file. You do not find them on podcasts talking to Joe Rogan or anybody else. But I cannot believe that people who command such resources have failed to reach the intellectual landing point, which I regard as completely obvious at this juncture, that you cannot negotiate complexity by analytic or centralized means. They must have understood that, and yet they continue with the trajectory.
Yeah. And what should everyday people that are not in the club, and there's a Chris Langham tweet I'll share with you if you're familiar with him. He's on X as one of the highest scoring IQ guys that sort of did a sort of pin tweet. I'd like your take on it. But let's bring it back down so we can philosophize on,
Yeah.
again, we're getting sucked back into who. But what if we are being supportive and we're saying take action? How do we extend likely lifespan from statist activities? Because we've already had the CV19 that looked actively of intent, I would say, as destructive to population and particularly pensioners, but also to children, it has to be said, and also with varying ethnic streams of outcomes. And I've actually got a Chinese friend who's from our community. I was laughing when you were saying surname first because he was explaining the exact same thing to me, his Chinese name. And also Bruce Lee. We were both fans of Bruce Lee. He went to Bruce Lee's school, funny enough. But anyway, we were having a convo. Yes. Anyway, we were having a conversation, and his comment is actually in China, the mortuaries are still making out like gangsters, and that the mortality rate, and as someone who is a trained actuary, you'll appreciate this better than anyone, mortality rate has not come back down to the pre-CV19 level. So although you had this huge spike, it hasn't returned entirely, and that all forms mortality, particularly dreaded disease, shots, clots, heart attacks, cancers, are at escalating highs, and that actually the Chinese mood, he's in Hong Kong, but he's referencing Hong Kong and Chinese mood from his contacts, is actually quite negative on mortality. People are disappearing. Their population and growth numbers are down. And of course, their property market, which got super pumped after we went into the depression of our property market, they did the same thing, but just out of sync to create a bit of heat in the economy, are all deep under the water. The middle classes have never had a property-based collapse like they've had here. So it's really interesting getting his particular local take. And he's not a filtered through media. He's not a China wrecked guy. But a lot of the people that are dollar maximalists, they just love talking about China's property market. It is true, it's wrecked. But I found that interesting. So what is your take when you bear in mind the events of CV19? Because you set up Panda, and just tell everybody what that stands for as well.
Look, I mean, we originally set up Panda under the advice of the public relations firm that I was, working with under the portmanteau of pandemics, data and analytics, Panda. And it was really just a very quick response to our having considered the emergent data of the COVID phenomenon and realizing that there was absolutely nothing to respond to, and that that over the period of just a few short months eventually led to the insight that this was actually an information war with undertones of,
what about a compliance war?
Yeah, increasing acceptance of the diminution of in civil liberties and human rights and freedoms, and the testing of various mandatory propositions on populations. So, I mean, my point of view is that there was no pandemic there. There was no novel virus. This was all information warfare artifact. But I want to get back to the question you started with before your monologue there, which was what do I say to people that they should do? Centralized policies are guaranteed to fail, and when they fail, you are best positioned if you are a person who has not attended to centralization, but who has attended to localism. So your currency will stop being what's in your bank account, and what you have managed to secure by way of relationships of trust and of skills that are valued by the people around you in your local communities. When the calamity comes, and it will, the people who will survive are not going to be the office gnomes, and who are not going to be the government bureaucrats. They're not going to be welfare recipients. They will be people who have skills and abilities and relationships of trust in their local communities. That will be the currency. And I can't say how many people will die and whether we'll go all the way to the 500 million of the Georgia Guidestones, or whether this will actually fall apart much quicker than everybody suspects. And by the way, I am actually closer to the latter than the former. because I just watch the comical stuff going wrong with all the projects these guys try to implement. I mean, the reason we're not sitting with central bank digital currencies and digital ID systems and infinite control of our lives is that these systems are very difficult to implement, and they have all sorts of unintended consequences. And I think there's money being thrown at these problems, and as fast as they throw it, as fast as the projects fail. And so I think the undoing of centralist prerogatives will come rather sooner than many people fear. But
will the power brokers give power back to the local levels and back
No,
out?
it doesn't get given
You're never
back.
going to get that. You don't. And how do we take it back when they
No, it never is never given back to you.
Never.
It comes back to you because the center collapses. I like to use the story of the collapsing Roman Empire in Magna Britannica, Great Britain. The garrisons on Hadrian's Wall melted away. And the interesting little tidbit of history that comes down to us is that many of them melted away to the north. They went into the barbarians' territory because, having been stationed there for years, they had come to know the people on the other side. They'd established real human links, and they realized, that place.
And they stopped getting paid by the bad money and the coin clipping. So they eventually
stopped being
did something
paid,
useful there.
And the ground behind them was scorched by the centralizers. By they realized that this is a mess behind us. We're better off with the barbarians. And so many of them decamped into the Pictish territory. I'm exaggerating slightly. The place where the people painted themselves blue, and ran around naked. It wasn't as bad as that, because that kind of polarizing construct was, of course, the work of a central authority, Rome. And so I don't think it's necessary to conceive of power being given back to us. There will be a vacuum, and you will turn around, and the people who will be most horrified will be the bureaucrats and office workers. The Dilbert cartoon, shame mentioning Scott Adams right now, it's a bit poignant, but it'll be the office gnomes, the bureaucrats, the academics, who find that they have no relationships out in the real world and no real skills that are of value to man or beast. They will all die. And people who are more grounded, your people who practice real skills that other people, provide services and goods that other people buy, and who are able to solve problems in the real world in a way that's evaluated by markets and by their fellow man, they will have a much better chance. And so be one of those. And that goes along with the financial advice we gave at the beginning. Invest with people who do that. Get as close to as possible. Avoid intermediation. Disintermediate. Invest in the real economy. And so you're good on gold and silver. Relative to the place I work, that's all rather inanimate. But I see your point. It's real stuff. It's commodities. You can touch it. It's tangible. And that's a type of disintermediation.
We aren't stuck on one thing, if I can just correct that notion. We're in a monetary-based collapse, so we focus now for the weapon of choice, which is monetary metals. When we get to the shortage of wheat grain, you utilize the gold and the silver, and you are procuring productive agricultural land. And so the self-reliance. So this is more dominoes than that's a final position and I'm dying on that hill. I think you have to be dispassionate and not married. I remember the brokers with the buy gold stickers of the 80s, the pins on them. That wasn't the right position during the financialization of everything and the suppression of precious metals at all. It was a death ticket. You would have lived in the poorhouse. Build wealth, secure that wealth, and then broaden it out and multiple income streams, and be useful and self-reliant. So
100%.
That's more our point. Right now, I'm talking about that because we're in a fiat and debt-based collapse, and that's a monetary phenomenon, not but it leads to food and all the other things in due course.
I hope you're not going to ask me to give concluding remarks, because I think you've done it very well.
Thank you. Yeah. So thank you, first of all, immensely for your time. I love the point of self-reliance, but you're also more important than self-reliance, having your own solar, having your own water. You're reasserting and coming hard on the community and the relationships elements, being a man of integrity in times of great inversion, perversion, where people just can take you at face value. You're the kind of neighbor everybody wants. They'll tell you if you know the truth, regardless whether it's good or bad. And I love that you brought that. Nick, how can people engage with you in terms of your business? Are you, private equity? How can they find you? Please tell everyone that's watching who'd like to follow you. And I put you down as a big recommend for well thought out missives. How can people engage with you further?
In terms of people who live within 10 kilometers of me,
socially, internationally, media, and
yes.
your digital presence. But then if you
So
want to.
the first thing is we very much value direct interaction. We like face-to-face meetings. So people in the vicinity of Cape Town are welcome to knock on the door. If they're like-minded, we all welcome them even more. In terms of people further afield, censorship and reach limitation has, turned me off a lot of action on social media and so on, but I'm still visible to those who try hard enough to really follow me and see what I've been saying on the handle of Nick Hudson CT, which stands for Cape Town, being a localist. And I have a presence there on X and on Substack. I don't know for how long.
Yes, there's that other thing that social media is also part of the great scrape and profiling exercise. I feel it. I'm torn between the drives business and at the same time I want out. It's a big crazy dichotomy. Thank you so much for your time, and I'd love to come and see
Wonderful.
you personally, and we'll have
Please
a coffee
do.
somewhere. I won't dox you for location just yet, but we'll be in touch for that one. Thanks again, Nick, and have a great evening.
No, thanks very much, Francis. A wonderful and energizing conversation. I appreciate it.
Tired of profit wipeouts and blown accounts from following trade signal groups and other YouTube channels? Looking for a better way to trade, reduce your stress, and minimize your risk? Become a skilled technical analyst and see the charts and markets in a new light using the successfully proven HVF method by Francis Hunt, while being surrounded and supported by a principled, structured, and experienced community. Enjoy a constructive learning environment while practically trading markets, supported by a bespoke platform run through browser and app, specifically designed to teach and engage you whilst learning and growing as the markets move. This is not a Telegram or Slack signal group. All trade ideas are based on a proprietary technical analysis process honed over decades, which is the HVF method, leading to trade ideas with fast-moving breakouts and tight stops, exact entries and exits, nuanced interim considerations, and ultimately, strong rewards. Submissions are graded and scored by Francis for potential high-quality setups, and we provide bespoke tools to help get the job done properly and with precision. Over time and with focused effort, you'll begin to look at charts and price action just like Francis. Community updates every day by Francis and our 3 webinars a week provide a 360-degree approach, which are presented by our experienced team of trade leaders to spot potential trades. We're a community of self-actualized individuals, spanning the globe and active 24/7, 365. The premium community provides a warm, supportive, and cooperative place for people willing to listen, participate, contribute, and to learn. We've changed thousands of traders' lives. Transform your approach to trading now. Transform your life. Book an introductory call with us on the link below.